There is something that happens in the physical dimension of a relationship with an avoidant that almost nobody talks about honestly, something that exists in direct, almost violent contradiction to everything else the dynamic produces. Everything else in the relationship with an avoidant is characterized by distance, by the managed, careful, often painful insufficiency of emotional availability, by the withdrawals and the silences and the maddening half-presence of someone who is genuinely there and genuinely not there simultaneously, by the specific, grinding, daily cost of loving someone whose fear of closeness keeps the connection at a temperature that never quite reaches the warmth you need it to sustain. You know that dynamic. You have lived in it, you understand its contours and its costs and the specific way it erodes something in you over time. And then there is the physical dimension, which is none of those things. Which is in fact so far from those things that encountering it for the first time, encountering the specific, overwhelming, entirely disorienting intensity that an avoidant brings to physical intimacy, produces a kind of whiplash that most people never fully recover from. Because nothing in the emotional architecture of the relationship prepares you for it. Nothing in the careful distance and the managed composure and the withdrawn, defended, hard-to-reach quality of how they exist in the relationship emotionally gives any adequate warning of what they become when the emotional management systems temporarily come offline and the body takes over. And the body of an avoidant, freed from the surveillance of the defended mind, is one of the most intense and most overwhelming physical presences available in human intimacy. Understanding why requires going somewhere most conversations about avoidant attachment never go. Into the specific psychology of what physical intimacy represents for someone whose emotional channels are blocked, and what gets rerouted through the physical channel when the emotional one is closed, and why the intensity that results is simultaneously one of the most powerful draws and one of the most destabilizing forces available in a relationship. This is that conversation. Before going into the psychology, the foundation requires an honest statement about what this conversation is and is not. This is not a romanticization of the intensity. It is not the suggestion that the sexual and physical dimension of avoidant relationships is a feature that compensates for the emotional insufficiency. It is not a reason to stay in something that is consistently failing to meet your emotional needs, because the physical intensity makes the failing feel worth absorbing. The intensity is real. Its origins are psychologically coherent and worth understanding, and it does not compensate for emotional unavailability. It coexists with it. Sometimes it obscures it, and sometimes, often it is one of the mechanisms by which people remain in dynamics that are not serving them. Because the physical intensity creates a bond that the emotional insufficiency is simultaneously eroding, and the bond created by the body is, in many people's experience, harder to walk away from than the bond created by the mind. That is important to hold. The intensity is real, and it is not sufficient. Both things simultaneously. Now into the psychology. To understand why avoidants are sexually intense, you need to understand what physical intimacy represents in a specific psychological economy of someone whose emotional channels are heavily defended. The avoidant's defensive architecture, the walls, the distance, the careful management of emotional exposure, is not a global shutdown of all vulnerability. It is a targeted shutdown of the specific channels through which emotional vulnerability is most directly transmitted. Through words. Through the explicit declaration of feeling, through the sustained, undefended, mutually visible emotional presence that genuine intimacy in its fullest form requires. These channels are where the fear lives. These are the doors the architecture was built to keep closed, because these are the channels through which, in the avoidance formative experience, vulnerability produced its most painful outcomes. The child who reached for emotional connection and found dismissal learned to close those channels, to route the need away from the path that led to pain, to find other expressions for a wanting that could not be safely expressed through its most direct form. The body is one of those other expressions, and in the specific economy of avoidant psychology, the body often becomes the primary channel through which the enormous reservoir of feeling that the emotional channels are preventing from surfacing finds its way out. This is not a conscious decision. The avoidant does not sit with the awareness that they are using physical intimacy as a displacement for emotional intimacy that feels too dangerous to access directly. The rerouting is automatic. It is the nervous system finding the path of least resistance for a need that must go somewhere and cannot go through the blocked channels. And the physical channel, the body, the skin, the immediate and non-linguistic and non-declarative form of contact that physical intimacy provides, is less defended than the emotional channels. It does not require the same explicit vulnerability. It does not produce the same legible record of need that words produce. It allows the connection to be real and present and overwhelming in its realness without the specific exposure that the emotional channels would demand. What this means in practice is that an avoidant brings to physical intimacy the full, compressed, long-accumulated weight of everything that has not been allowed through the emotional channels. Every unexpressed feeling, every withheld tenderness, every moment of genuine connection that was felt and not communicated, that arrived in the interior and was routed around rather than expressed. Every piece of the enormous, real, deeply held emotional world that the avoidant carries and cannot access through the ordinary channels of human emotional expression. All of it, in the physical encounter, finds release. The result is intensity that is qualitatively different from the intensity of people whose emotional and physical channels are more integrated. The person who can say "I love you" easily, who can be emotionally present and vulnerable in the ordinary daily ways that secure attachment allows, distributes the emotional weight across all the available channels. The physical intimacy carries its own weight, but it carries it alongside the verbal expressions and the emotional presence and the consistent daily life availability. The weight is distributed. In the avoidant, the weight is not distributed. It is concentrated. The physical channel is carrying not just its own weight, but the weight of everything the other channels are blocking. And the concentrated weight, when it finds expression, produces an intensity that is genuinely overwhelming to most people who encounter it. An urgency, a hunger, a quality of presence in the physical encounter that is so complete and so undefended and so entirely unlike the defended, managed, emotionally guarded presentation of ordinary life that it seems impossible that the two could belong to the same person. But they do. They belong to the same person at different levels of the defensive architecture's engagement. The ordinary daily presentation is the defended level, the level at which the fear is active and the channels are monitored and the vulnerability is managed. The physical intimacy, at its most intense, is the level at which the defense briefly disengages, at which the body moves faster than the fear can intercept, at which the full, unmanaged, compressed and finally finding release weight of the avoidance interior life makes contact with another person in the only form currently available to it. The disengagement of the defense during physical intimacy is not total. This is important to understand because it explains one of the most disorienting features of avoidant physical intensity, the way it can shift, sometimes within the same encounter, between the fully present and the suddenly withdrawn. Between the overwhelming intimacy of someone who is entirely there and the disconcerting quality of someone who has partially left the room while their body is still in it, the defense disengages in stages. And each stage represents a level of vulnerability that the avoidance sphere is evaluating in real time, even during the encounter. At the early stages of the disengagement, the physical channel opens and the intensity arrives. The compressed weight finds release. The body communicates what the words cannot. And the person on the receiving end of this is in the presence of something that is genuinely, specifically overwhelming in its authenticity and its force. But as the encounter deepens, as the vulnerability increases, as the intimacy moves from physical to something that begins to blur the boundary between physical and emotional, as the connection becomes sufficiently real and sufficiently present that it starts to activate the fear that the defense was built to prevent, the defense reasserts. Not always dramatically, sometimes as a subtle shift in the quality of presence. A slight withdrawal of the attention, a micro-distance that appears where full presence was a moment before. A quality of the person being slightly less entirely there than they were before the fear was activated. And the person on the receiving end of this shift, who was a moment ago in the presence of overwhelming, undefended, entirely present intensity, encounters the sudden, disorienting quality of partial absence. Of someone who is physically there and has emotionally and cognitively partially retreated, and the shift from the overwhelming presence to the partial absence is one of the most specifically destabilizing experiences available in physical intimacy with an avoidant. Because the contrast between the two states is so extreme that the partial absence feels, in the immediate aftermath of the overwhelming presence, like a loss, like something has been taken away. Like the version of the person who was entirely there was the real one, and the version that has partially retreated is a diminishment of it. This contrast is one of the primary mechanisms by which physical intimacy with an avoidant creates the specific, powerful, difficult to break bond that most people find themselves unable to walk away from, even when the emotional dimension of the relationship is clearly and consistently insufficient. The human reward system responds to intermittent intensity in a way that is disproportionate to its actual frequency. The moments of overwhelming presence, of complete, undefended, fully there intensity, create a neurological imprint that the ordinary, consistent, available warmth of a secure relationship does not create to the same degree. Not because the ordinary warmth is less valuable, because the scarcity and the intensity of the avoidant's full presence, when it appears, activates the reward system at a level that consistent availability does not produce. The brain registers the intermittent, overwhelming experience as more significant than the consistent, moderate experience, in the same way that the brain registers any intermittent reward as more motivating than a consistent one. And then the partial withdrawal comes. And the absence of the overwhelming presence creates the specific activated seeking behavior that the reward system produces when the expected reward does not arrive. The wanting increases. The attention focuses. The mind begins the specific compulsive work of trying to understand what changed and how to return to the state of overwhelming presence and when it will be available again. This is not weakness. This is not the behavior of someone who is particularly susceptible to unhealthy dynamics. This is the basic operating system of a human reward architecture encountering one of its most reliably activating stimuli. The intermittent, intense, unpredictably available experience of someone who is occasionally entirely present and then partially withdrawn. The system was not designed to manage this experience with equanimity. It was designed to seek the reward when the reward is available and to increase the seeking behavior when the reward becomes unpredictable. The bond that forms in this context is one of the most powerful and most difficult to dissolve bonds available in human relational experience. Not because it is the most nourishing, because it is the most activating. And activation and nourishment are not the same thing, however much the activation can feel, in the moments of its greatest intensity, like the most alive version of being nourished. There is a specific aspect of avoidant physical intensity that deserves its own examination because it is the aspect that is most frequently misunderstood and most frequently used, by both parties in different ways. As a substitute for the emotional intimacy the relationship is not consistently providing. It is the quality of being seen during physical intimacy that the avoidant provides, and that is so specific and so powerful that many people describe it as unlike anything they have experienced in other relationships. The avoidant, whose emotional channels are blocked, develops through the necessity of those blocked channels an extraordinary attunement to the non-verbal, to the physical signals that carry emotional information without requiring the emotional channel to be open, to the body's language, the specific tensions and releases, the micro-expressions, the quality of breathing and presence that communicate interior states more accurately than words in many circumstances. This attunement is not a skill they developed deliberately. It is the adaptive compensation of a nervous system that needed to maintain connection without the emotional channels being available, that learned to read the unspoken because the spoken was not the available channel. And in physical intimacy, this attunement produces a quality of attention that is genuinely extraordinary. The avoidant is present to the body in a way that most people are not. Attuned to the specific, individual, unrepeatable physical reality of the person they are with, in ways that produce the overwhelming experience of being genuinely, specifically seen. Not as a category, as this person, this specific, individual, bodily, and therefore fully human person in this specific moment with this specific quality of presence. This seeing through the body in the physical encounter is often the closest thing to genuine emotional intimacy that the avoidant can access and provide. It is real seeing. It is not a performance of intimacy without the substance. It is the substance expressed through the only channel currently available to the avoidant for the kind of undefended, genuine, fully present contact that the intimacy requires. And for the person receiving it, it can feel like being more genuinely seen than they have ever been in any previous relationship, more specifically known, more individually recognized. Because the attunement is real and the seeing is accurate, and the quality of presence the avoidant brings to the encounter is genuinely extraordinary, even if it is available only through this channel and only when the defense is sufficiently disengaged. The problem, and it is a genuine, significant, important to name problem, is what comes after. The disengagement of the defense that makes the intensity possible is temporary. The defense was not permanently dismantled by the encounter. It was suspended. And as the encounter ends and the ordinary conditions of daily life reassert themselves, as the emotional channels come back under surveillance, and the fear reasserts and the defended architecture reconstitutes, the quality of presence that was available during the encounter becomes unavailable again. And the person who was in the presence of the full, undefended, entirely present version of the avoidant is now in the presence of the ordinary, defended, emotionally managed version, who may seem almost like a different person, who brings to the daily interactions the careful, measured, managed distance quality that characterizes avoidant emotional engagement, and that is in such extreme contrast to the intensity of the physical encounter that the contrast itself becomes a source of pain. The daily reality of emotional unavailability, after the physical reality of complete presence, is one of the most disorienting and most damaging experiences available in relationship with an avoidant. Because it creates a model, a lived, embodied, neurologically encoded model of what the person is capable of. The model says they can be entirely present, they can be that fully available. The encounter was evidence, and then the daily reality says they are not that present, they are not that available. And the gap between the model and the daily reality produces a specific, grinding, impossible to habituate to pain. The pain of knowing what is possible and watching what is consistent fall consistently short of it. This gap is why most people cannot handle the avoidance physical intensity over time. Not because the intensity is too much, because the intensity is exactly enough to create the bond, enough to establish the model, enough to demonstrate what the person is capable of, and then the emotional dimension of the relationship consistently fails to meet the standard that the intensity set. The most common experience of people who have been in relationship with an avoidant is not the physical intensity being overwhelming in itself. It is the specific, exhausting, emotionally depleting experience of a relationship in which the physical dimension delivers extraordinary presence and the emotional dimension delivers chronic insufficiency. And the combination of the two creates a bond that is simultaneously activating and painful, in a way that is very difficult to leave, because the activating is real and the pain is also real, and the two are so thoroughly braided together that extracting one without the other seems impossible. Most people who try to leave a relationship with an avoidant describe a specific form of the difficulty that is distinct from the difficulty of leaving other kinds of relationships. It is not primarily the grief of losing the person. It is the grief of losing the specific, intense, overwhelming physical presence, the moments of complete, undefended, entirely their intimacy that the relationship made available. The fear that nothing else will ever produce that specific quality of experience. That the intensity was not just the avoidant being intense, but the avoidant and you creating something specific and unrepeatable, that the particular combination of two people and their particular resonance and the particular way the avoidance defense is released in the encounter with this specific person produced. That fear is sometimes accurate. The intensity was specific, the resonance was real. The combination of two particular people in a particular dynamic does produce something that is not automatically reproducible with someone else. And knowing this, holding the genuine, honest acknowledgement of the specific quality of what existed alongside the equally genuine, equally honest acknowledgement of what the relationship was consistently unable to provide, is one of the most difficult pieces of clarity available in the aftermath of this kind of connection. Here is what handling the avoidance physical intensity actually requires. Not in the sense of being capable of receiving it. Most people are more than capable of receiving it. In the sense of being able to be in a relationship with someone whose physical and emotional channels are so dramatically misaligned, without the misalignment producing the specific, serious, ongoing damage that it typically produces. It requires an unusual degree of self-possession in the physical encounter, the capacity to be fully present in the intensity without losing your own ground in it, without allowing the overwhelming quality of the avoidance physical presence to become the primary anchor of your sense of connection and value in the relationship. Without the bond that forms in the encounter becoming the primary evidence you are using to answer the question of whether the relationship is sufficient. This is genuinely difficult because the intensity is designed, not deliberately, but functionally, to be the most compelling available argument for the relationship's value. To be so real and so specific and so overwhelming in its quality that it creates, in the person receiving it, the embodied conviction that something extraordinary is happening, that the relationship contains something irreplaceable, that the insufficiencies of the daily emotional reality are aberrations from the true character of the connection rather than the true character of the connection itself. The self-possession required to hold the intensity and the insufficiency in the same honest accounting, to be moved by the encounter without allowing the being moved to override the clarity about what the rest of the relationship is providing, is one of the most demanding capacities available in the landscape of human relational experience. Most people cannot sustain it indefinitely, not because they are not strong enough, because the specific combination of intermittent, overwhelming presence and consistent emotional insufficiency is precisely calibrated, again not deliberately, but functionally, to erode the self-possession over time, to create, through the alternation of intensity and withdrawal, a state of chronic activation that makes the calm, clear, honest assessment of the relationship's overall sufficiency increasingly difficult to access. What is available to a person who loves an avoidant and understands the psychology of the intensity and wants to navigate it without the navigation costing them the specific serious things that avoidant dynamics typically cost is something more honest and more demanding than a set of strategies. It is the commitment to maintaining the honest accounting even when the intensity is making the accounting difficult. To returning regularly and specifically to the question of what the relationship is providing across all its dimensions, not just the physical, not just the moments of intensity, but the daily emotional reality and the consistency and the presence in the ordinary moments, and the repair when things go wrong, and the showing up on the Tuesday when nothing is at stake. To holding that full accounting, rather than allowing the physical intensity to serve as the primary evidence in a case that the accounting, if it were honest, would not support. This is not the instruction to ignore the intensity or to treat it as irrelevant. It is real and it is part of the full picture. It is the instruction to give it its proper weight rather than its disproportionate weight, to allow it to be one piece of the evidence rather than the piece that overrides all the others. To be in the encounter fully and to return from the encounter to the honest question of whether the full relationship, intensity and insufficiency together, is something you can genuinely sustain rather than something you are sustaining on the fuel of the intensity alone. Because sustaining on the fuel of the intensity alone is possible for a time. It is what most people in these dynamics do, without being fully aware that it is what they are doing. The intensity provides the energy that the emotional insufficiency is depleting. The encounter restores what the daily reality has been taking. The cycle sustains itself through this specific exchange for longer than is healthy, in many cases for years. Because the intensity is real enough and powerful enough and specific enough to keep powering the dynamic past the point where the honest accounting would have produced a different conclusion. The avoidants themselves, in most cases, do not fully understand what they bring to physical intimacy, or why it has the effect it has. They do not experience the intensity as the displaced weight of all the emotional channels they have closed. They experience it as the specific, genuine, fully present desire for another person who means something to them, which is what it also is. The displacement is not a negation of the desire. The desire is real and the displacement is real, and both are occurring simultaneously. What they tend to understand more clearly, through the accumulated evidence of relational history, is that something happens in this dimension of their relationships that does not happen for other people in the same way. That the people they are with respond to them physically in ways that seem disproportionate to the overall investment. That the bond formed through physical intimacy is more powerful, more difficult to dissolve, more persistently present in the other person's experience than the avoidance understanding of the relationship's overall insufficiency might predict. And some avoidants, with some degree of self-awareness, understand that this disproportionate bond is not something the other person chose deliberately, that it is the product of the specific combination of the intensity and the intermittency, that it creates a holding on that the relationship's emotional dimension might not justify if the physical dimension were not so overwhelmingly compelling. And some of those avoidants use this understanding badly, using the intensity to maintain access to the connection without addressing the emotional insufficiency that the intensity is compensating for. Not always deliberately, not always with the full awareness of what the using amounts to, but functionally. Others understand it and are genuinely distressed by it, are aware at some level that the intensity is creating a bond in another person that they are not fully able to honor with the emotional availability that a bond of that depth deserves. And that awareness is its own form of the fear of love, the awareness of the weight of what the intensity creates and the fear of being responsible for something they are not sure they can adequately meet. The people who cannot handle avoidant physical intensity are not people who are too sensitive or too emotionally needy or insufficiently able to manage a complex relationship. They are people who are honest, who feel what the intensity creates and take it seriously as the bond it is, and find in the daily emotional reality of the relationship an insufficiency that the bond makes more rather than less painful. The people who handle it best are not the people who feel the intensity less. They are the people who maintain the honest accounting most consistently, who return from the encounter to the full picture most reliably, who love what is real in the avoidant, the intensity, the specific quality of presence, the displaced emotional weight that is genuine feeling however it is expressed, without allowing the loving of those things to become the primary argument against the clear-eyed assessment of whether the relationship overall is something that is building them or depleting them. That distinction between the thing being real and the thing being sufficient is the central distinction in everything this conversation has been about. The intensity is real. The love that produces it is real. The specific quality of what the avoidant brings to physical intimacy is not performance and not strategy and not the manipulation of someone who has learned to use their body as a substitute for the emotional availability they cannot provide. It is the avoidant, in the only form currently available to them, being entirely present. And that entirely present form, real and overwhelming, and specifically bonding and ultimately insufficient on its own as the foundation of a relationship that must also exist on ordinary Tuesdays, is both the most compelling thing they offer and the thing most likely to keep you in something that deserves the honest accounting you have perhaps been too overwhelmed by the intensity to complete. Complete it now with the full picture. The intensity is one piece. You deserve the whole thing. The whole thing is not just the physical encounter and what it produces. The whole thing is the sum of every dimension of the relationship, weighted honestly rather than weighted by the most compelling available evidence. And the most compelling available evidence in a relationship with an avoidant is almost always the physical dimension. Not because it is the most important dimension. It is not. Because it is the most immediately, viscerally, neurologically persuasive. Because it operates on the body rather than on the mind, and the body's responses are faster and less amenable to honest examination than the mind's. Because the bond it creates is felt rather than thought, and felt things have a directness and an urgency that thought things can take longer to produce. The honest waiting requires stepping back far enough from the felt experience of the intensity to ask the question that the intensity makes difficult to ask. What is the whole relationship producing in me over time? Not in the best moments, not in the encounter and the hours immediately following it when the nervous system is still in the aftermath of something that registered as significant. In the ordinary daily texture of the weeks and months of being in this, what is the baseline? What does my life feel like from inside this relationship when nothing charged is happening? When the intensity is not present and the encounter is not recent and the bond is simply the background fact of my existence rather than the foreground experience of my present moment. That question, asked honestly and allowed to receive an honest answer rather than being quickly redirected toward the best moments as evidence, tells you more about the relationship's overall effect on you than anything the intensity can tell you. Because the intensity is real, but it is also episodic. It occupies a fraction of the total time the relationship occupies. And the rest of that time, the baseline, the daily, the ordinary, is where the relationship is actually being lived, where the emotional dimension's insufficiency is actually experienced, where the daily cost of the dynamic is actually deposited. The baseline of a relationship with an avoidant who has not done the work of addressing the fear that produces the emotional insufficiency tends to have a specific quality that people in the dynamic often have difficulty naming, directly because the intensity keeps disrupting the baseline and making it difficult to assess accurately. The disruption is part of the pattern. The encounter restores enough of the bond and enough of the activation to obscure, temporarily, the quality of the baseline that preceded it. And then the baseline reasserts, and then another encounter disrupts it. And the alternation between the two states makes both harder to assess because neither is allowed to stabilize long enough to be honestly evaluated. Stepping back far enough to assess the baseline requires some deliberate stillness, some willingness to sit with the question of what the relationship is like when the intensity is not present, rather than waiting for the next encounter to provide the answer. And the baseline, when it is honestly assessed, tends to carry one or several of a specific set of qualities that are worth naming. The first is a low-level, persistent, difficult-to-attribute anxiety. Not the acute anxiety of a crisis or a specific threat, the chronic background, always slightly present anxiety of someone who is in a relational situation in which important things are uncertain, in which the quality of the other person's engagement on any given day is not predictable, in which the emotional availability that a secure relationship provides as a steady background fact is instead a variable that requires ongoing monitoring. The anxiety is the nervous system's response to the specific, sustained instability of a dynamic whose primary consistent feature is its inconsistency. And because the anxiety is chronic rather than acute, because it is the background rather than the foreground, it tends to be normalized into simply how things feel, rather than recognized as the signal it is. The signal that something in the relational environment requires vigilance because something in the relational environment is not reliably safe. The second quality of the baseline is a specific form of loneliness that coexists with the technical presence of the relationship, not the loneliness of being alone. The loneliness of being with someone and still being alone, of being in a relationship that contains genuine feeling and still experiencing the specific particular ache of emotional needs that are not being met, of having a partner whose physical presence can be overwhelming and whose emotional presence is chronically insufficient. This loneliness is one of the most poorly understood and most genuinely painful experiences available in relational life. It does not resolve through more time spent together, because the time spent together does not address what is producing the loneliness, which is not the absence of the person, but the absence of the specific emotional availability that genuine togetherness requires. And it is made more painful, not less, by the knowledge of what the encounter produces, because the encounter produces, briefly, the experience of genuine connection. And then it ends, and the loneliness returns. And its return is experienced against the backdrop of having just had the evidence of what it would feel like if it were not there, which makes it more acute rather than less. The third quality of the baseline is the gradual, slow, difficult to notice diminishment of self. The way that sustained exposure to emotional insufficiency in the context of genuine love and genuine bond reshapes over time the person absorbing it, shrinks some things, qualifies others, creates, through the accumulated weight of unmet needs and unexpressed needs, and needs that were expressed and inadequately met, a version of yourself that is smaller in some specific ways than the version that entered the relationship. Not dramatically smaller. Not in ways that are immediately obvious from the inside, but in the specific measurable ways that become visible when you encounter in some other context or some other interaction the version of yourself that exists when the dynamic's gravity is not present. The version that has the preferences it set aside, the needs it stopped expressing because expressing them did not produce adequate response, the voice that got quieter because the dynamic did not have room for its full volume. Recognizing these qualities of the baseline, the chronic anxiety, the particular loneliness, the gradual diminishment, is not the same as deciding that the relationship must end. It is the same as deciding that the relationship must be seen clearly. That the intensity does not get to be the primary evidence in the assessment of whether the relationship is building you or depleting you. That the full picture includes not just the encounter and what it produces, but the baseline and what it contains. And seeing the full picture clearly, holding the intensity and the insufficiency, the bond and the baseline, the real feeling and the real cost in the same honest accounting, is the prerequisite for any genuinely good decision about what comes next. Not the decision made from the acute state of the encounter's aftermath, when the nervous system is flooded, and the bond is at its strongest and the relationship feels most irreplaceable. Not the decision made from the lowest point of the baseline, when the insufficiency is most painful, and the desire to leave is most urgent, and the relationship feels most unsustainable. The decision made from the still, clear, honest middle, where both the intensity and the insufficiency are visible, and neither is cancelling the other, and the question of what to do with what you see is being asked from the fullest and most accurate available picture. That still, clear, honest middle is harder to access than it sounds, because the dynamic is specifically, if not deliberately, organized to make it difficult to access. The alternation between intensity and insufficiency keeps the nervous system in a state that is not conducive to the calm, clear assessment of the full picture. The bond keeps the assessment emotionally complicated. The genuine love, which is real, the love for this person and this specific irreplaceable quality of what exists between you, keeps the honest seeing from producing the clean, comfortable conclusion that would make the decision easier. Accessing the still middle requires in most cases some physical and temporal distance from the intensity. Some period of not encounter in which the nervous system has the opportunity to return to its own baseline rather than operating from the flooded, bonded, activated state that the encounter produces. Some space in which the chronic anxiety and the particular loneliness and the gradual diminishment of the baseline become legible without the intensity immediately disrupting their legibility. This is one of the reasons why distance from an avoidant, genuine, sustained, physically and emotionally real distance, tends to produce clarity in the people who finally create it. Not because the distance eliminates the love or dissolves the bond, it does not, but because the distance removes the disruption that the intensity provides to the honest assessment of the baseline. And in the undisrupted baseline, the true cost of the dynamic becomes visible in ways that the alternation between intensity and insufficiency was always preventing. Many people in relationships with avoidance describe their clearest perception of what the relationship was actually costing them, not as occurring during the relationship, but in the aftermath of it. Not because the relationship ended and the grief produced insight, but because the ending removed the intensity's disruption of the baseline, and what became visible in the undisrupted state was the honest accounting of what the dynamic had been depositing over time, the anxiety they had been carrying as normal, the loneliness that had been the background texture of years, the version of themselves that was smaller in specific ways that became legible only in the presence of the self that slowly re-emerged when the dynamic's gravity was no longer present. There is something worth saying about what the avoidant experiences in the physical dimension that parallels in a way what the person they are with experiences. Because the conversation about avoidant physical intensity has been primarily focused on its impact on the receiver. But the avoidant's own experience of the intensity is worth examining, because it is, in its own way, as psychologically significant and as poorly understood as anything else about their interior world. For the avoidant, the physical encounter is one of the few available experiences of genuine undefended presence, of the specific, brief, entirely real experience of being with another person, without the surveillance of the defensive architecture determining the terms of the encounter. Of the wanting being simple and present, and not requiring the management and the monitoring and the careful emotional regulation that characterize the avoidance experience of all the other forms of closeness. It is, in other words, one of the few available experiences of rest, of the fear, temporarily not running, of the defended architecture not requiring active maintenance because the physical channel has found a way to the connection that bypasses the defended channels rather than requiring them to open, and the specific temporary quality of this rest, the knowledge, whether conscious or not, that it is available only in this context and not in the sustained daily emotional availability that the relationship also requires, is its own form of grief for the avoidant who has enough awareness to recognize it. The grief of knowing that the full presence is there, that the capacity for genuine, undefended, entirely real contact is present and available, and finding it accessible only through this channel and not through the broader relational availability that the person they are with needs and deserves. Some avoidants, in their most honest private moments, experience the intensity of their physical encounters as the saddest thing about themselves, as the evidence that the full presence is possible, that the capacity is not absent, only blocked, and that the blocking is costing the person they love something specific and real and not compensated for by the moments when the blocking temporarily ceases. This awareness does not automatically produce change. As has been said in other contexts and must be said again here, awareness without the behavioral work of changing the patterns that produce the awareness is simply knowing what you are doing while continuing to do it. But it is present in many avoidants alongside the intensity, the grief of the limitation alongside the genuine desire that the intensity expresses. Both real, both present, neither one sufficient on its own. The reason most people cannot handle avoidant physical intensity over time, the honest, complete, full picture reason, is not that the intensity is too much. It is that the intensity is too specifically, too precisely, too powerfully bonding for the emotional dimension of the relationship, to fail to meet without the failure producing serious and accumulating damage. The intensity creates a bond of a specific depth. The emotional insufficiency creates a wound of a specific depth, and the depth of the wound is calibrated with a terrible and involuntary precision to the depth of the bond. The bigger the bond the intensity creates, the bigger the wound the insufficiency produces, because the wound is not experienced in isolation. It is experienced against the specific background of what the bond established as possible. of what the encounter demonstrated the person was capable of what the intensity created as the baseline of what this relationship was supposed to feel like. And the daily insufficiency experienced against that background, against that demonstration of capacity, against that bond, is not experienced as the ordinary insufficiency of an ordinary relationship that was never particularly intense. It is experienced as a specific, personal, pointed contrast to something that was demonstrated to be possible and is consistently not being produced, which makes it more painful, not less. Which makes the gap between the capacity and the consistent delivery wider and more specifically felt, not narrower. This is the mechanism. The intensity creates the bond creates the standard, the emotional insufficiency fails the standard. The gap between the standard and the consistent delivery produces the specific, accumulating, serious damage that most people describe when they describe what relationship with an avoidant ultimately cost them. Most people cannot handle it, not because they cannot receive the intensity, because they cannot, over time, sustain the specific, serious damage of having the standard, the intensity established, consistently failed by the emotional dimension of the same relationship. Without the damage depositing in ways that are real and lasting and that require something more substantial than the next encounter to address. The intensity is real. The bond is real. The standard it creates is real. The damage of its consistent failure is real. The whole thing is all of these things simultaneously. And you, seeing it clearly, holding it honestly, neither romanticizing the intensity nor dismissing the damage, are in the most accurate possible position for the most important possible question. What do you do with what you see? Not from the encounter's aftermath, not from the baseline's lowest point, from the still, clear, honest middle where both things are visible and neither is cancelling the other. From there, that is where the answer lives. And that is where you have always deserved to find it.